So here's a question for you. What do the following occupations all have in common? Airline pilots,
Investors,
surgeons,
No, now you're doing it well.
and civil engineers. Well, all of those occupations are highly complex in nature, and therefore the individuals who work in these occupations tend to be highly skilled, highly trained, and possess a high level of competencies as well. And as a consequence, these jobs are highly prestigious and are therefore highly compensated as well. Here's the second question. How can you single-handedly improve your productivity, your accuracy, and your team's engagement? And no, I'm not going to try to sell you some sort of magical product. In fact, the answer to that question is mundanely boring. But before you die of a bombardment of questions, I'm going to give you one final question. How can you single-handedly improve your productivity, accuracy, and team engagement by using this mundanely boring tool that all of those aforementioned occupations utilize at little to no cost? Well, if the answer to that question appeals to you, then stay tuned and let's dive into the video and delve into that magical tool. So a potential reason as to why this rather mundane tool has not really achieved universal application or adoption may simply because it's quite a mundane tool. We as humans are drawn to products, tools and objects that have a sense of mysticism about them, something that excites the senses or is on the cutting edge of technology. So an example of these kind of cutting edge products could be, for example, a slimming pill. It will help you achieve that body of your dreams. You'll look like that model you aspire to be. When in reality, what you simply really need to do is have a regimented form of diet and exercise. Another example, something that we all possibly could have fallen victim to, is during our adolescent years, when we suffer from a little bit of acne that unfortunately does a big blow of damage to our confidence. And therefore we might look to get some sort of creams or pills that promises to banish that acne forever, and therefore you'll become much more confident. Of course, these kind of products, they promise a lot, but do they actually deliver? Not really, but they're marketed in a way to make us think they will. And because they're presented in such an amazing way, sometimes we fall victim to this kind of marketing. So for answer to the questions I asked earlier about achieving greater productivity, accuracy and team engagement, well, it certainly isn't something that's mythical, it certainly doesn't excite the senses, and nor is it on the cutting edge of technology. But it's very humble, easy to use and easily adopted. The answer to those questions is a humble checklist. And this book goes through a lot of examples of how a checklist can be used to achieve greater productivity, accuracy and team engagement. So let's go through the key messages. So of course, all of those occupations, as I've mentioned before, are very complex in nature. Now checklists can be used to navigate around this issue. So let's start off with surgeons. Now medicine is a very broad area and there's many super specialisms that are eventually taking place. So if we look at, for example, anesthesiologists, these can be further subcategorized into different areas. For example, pediatric, cardiac, neurosurgical, and many other specialisms. It's therefore obvious that medicine is a super specialized area. And when you consider there are around 50 million surgeries taking place in the US alone every year, you can see why complexity is such an issue. So let's look at some numbers. Now unfortunately, of those 50 million surgeries that take place annually in the United States of America, around 150,000 deaths occur, which results in a fatality rate of 0.3%. Now, okay, 0.3%, that's a pretty low statistic, but these are individual lives we are talking about. And there's been numerous studies that cite at least half of those deaths could have been avoided. And this is down to the sheer level of complexity that is involved in these surgeries. So how can we navigate around this issue? So the issue of complexity can be split into two key areas. The first of which is down to the fallibility of human memory and attention. So when you're evaluating a sick patient, you are going through a process that an engineer would call an all or none process. So in other words, when you're evaluating that sick patient and you skip one step, you might as well have not made the effort of evaluating that sick person at all. The second element of complexity is the fact that when it comes to complex processes, people can lull themselves into skipping certain steps even if they remember them. And that's because, let's say for example, you do a process 100 times and despite there being a step to control a certain risk, that risk never really arose. And therefore, you might decide to skip that step because you have comfort in knowing that you've done it 100 times and maybe it's not even needed. But of course, the time you do skip it might be the time that risk arises, and that's when real damage takes place. So before I bore you to death about going on about the merits of a checklist, let's take a look into seeing why I think they make such a material difference. And we're going to do that by looking into the tale of Peter Pronovost. In the words of the author, Atul Gawande, Peter Pronovost is an individual whose work has saved more lives than any other laboratory scientist in the past decade. So Peter Pronovost's work was focused around central line infections. Now for those who come from a non-medical background, such as myself, a central line is a tube that has been attached to one of the large veins when you undertake a surgery. So in mapping out the checklist, he focused on 5 key checks. Number 1, wash your hands with soap. And as according to Boris Johnson, make sure you sing happy birthday twice whilst washing your hands to make sure you get rid of all that nasty bacteria. The second step was to clean the patient's skin with antiseptic. The step was to put sterile drapes over the entire patient. The fourth step was to wear a mask, hat, sterile gown and gloves. And the fifth step was to put a sterile dressing over the insertion site. Now to a surgeon, those 5 checks are a no-brainer. It's part and parcel of their daily business as usual routine. But Peter managed to convince the Johns Hopkins Hospital administration into allowing a test that would put his checklist into action over the course of a year. So for a year, Peter and his team monitored the results of what would happen were this checklist to be put into place. And the results? Well, they were so dramatic that Peter and his team couldn't actually believe it at first. And now, to avoid any sampling bias, because you know, it's just one hospital, what would happen if that checklist was put into effect across the whole of Michigan? Well, that's what I will tell you, and the results were even more dramatic. So within the first 3 months of the project going ahead, Michigan's intensive care units' central line infection rate decreased by 66%. And in fact, a lot of the intensive care units' central line infection rate decreased all the way down to 0. The results were so dramatic that Michigan's intensive care units outperformed 90% of intensive care units nationwide. After 18 months of the checklist being used, over 1,500 lives and $175 million were saved. And that's all because of a simple, humble, yet quite brilliant checklist being used. Now, as I've mentioned before, surgeons are not the sole users of checklists. So if you were to go on a walk across London, New York, or some other capital city, you might come across a fantastic looking building, something that inspires a real sense of awe within you, which might leave you to wonder, how on earth did we as humans manage to build such an impressive piece of architecture? Well, the answer to such an exciting question is unfortunately quite mundanely boring. And that's because, just like surgeons, the people who build these whopping big skyscrapers also use checklists. So the entire procedure of bringing around an architect's plan and transitioning it into a reality is ultimately guided by a checklist. Now, obviously there's an absence of a complete master of construction, someone who understands every aspect, every nuance, every intricacy about construction. So in the absence of this perfect individual existing, what would typically happen is a team of 16 specialists, each representing a different trade, would come together to discuss and plan on how to create this checklist that will guide the entire procedure. Once this plan has been created, it will be independently checked, evaluated and verified. Obviously when you're working in construction, you have no room for error. Therefore, once this plan has been created, it will be checked by subcontractors, independent experts and structural engineering specialists. And the end result? Well, that is simply a succession of different checklists to guide the entire process from start to finish into reality. Now, interestingly, the checklists aren't built solely around tasks. They're also built to control for communication as well. And this is because in the absence of that perfect master constructor, a constant stream of communication is vital to ensure any risks that may arise may be dealt with timely and efficiently. Now, obviously there are more nuances and things thrown into that process, but bear in mind we are looking at this from a very high level view. But before we leave the construction industry, here's a fun fact. Citigroup Center's iconic slanted roof had a fatal flaw identified by a Princeton engineering student. Once every 55 years, New York suffers from 70-mile-per-hour winds. In these circumstances, the building would collapse as the joints would fail. This quickly resulted in a reinforcing of the joints to prevent any risk of collapse. Obviously, there's a fallibility of man coming into play here, but if master builders use checklists all the time, it might explain why the USA has only a 0.0000002% annual avoidable failure rate. When it comes to crises for pilots, they also use checklists. Now let's say, for example, you have a pilot of the United Airlines flight 811. Something has happened. There's tremendous noise, there's debris flying everywhere, and your own heart is beating like a jackhammer. As the captain, you're aware there's an immediate oxygen problem, the third engine has been disabled, the fourth engine is on fire, and the outer wing flaps have been severely damaged. So what on earth do you do? Well, you reach for a checklist. Whilst 9 lives might have been lost to the explosive decompression within the aircraft, that plane was then able to land onto Honolulu without any further loss of lives. So whilst a lot of that is down to the pilot's own skill, there's also a lot of credit to be given to that simple, humble, but brilliant checklist. Now, if that doesn't sell you on a checklist and the fact that pilots automatically reach for them when there's a crisis, I simply don't know what will. But there's one more example that I would like to give to you before we close the book on checklists. Now, investors also use checklists. If we take the investment process to be research, decision making, execution, and then monitoring, well, one investor had a checklist for each of those stages. The checklist not only enabled this investor and his team to ruthlessly analyze companies really quickly, but also saved them from a very bad investment. So, for example, one day the investor found a company that looked like to be an excellent opportunity. However, the checklist had a check to make sure to read all of financial companies' disclosure notes, and it turned out that company's senior directors had quietly sold off all of their shares, and that is a giant red flag. So the checklist saved him from making an investment that would have surely tanked in value. Another investor, Guy Spier, used to have an analyst working under him. But Guy had managed to create a checklist that was so powerful and enabled him to become so productive, he simply did not need that analyst anymore. Hopefully this video has made it blatantly clear on how powerful a checklist can be. A checklist is essentially a cognitive net and helps capture any issues we have as humans, be it our memory, our attention to detail, or our thoroughness. So the question therefore emerges, how can we build a good checklist? And this is something I want to explore with you in the next part of this video. First of all, you have to decide if you want a read-do checklist, which is carrying out the task as you read that checklist, or whether you prefer the alternative, which is a do-confirm checklist, which is doing a task from memory and then checking it over with the use of that checklist. There are a few other factors you should consider when building that checklist, such as the level of precision, the level of efficiency, whether it's to the point or not, if it's easy to use, and if it highlights potential pitfalls, all of which I find keystone to building a good checklist. I myself aim to finish my day with a checklist which will detail the priorities of the next day. This helps keep me motivated, focused, prevents any failure of deliverables, and ensures I have daily goals for the next working day. When it comes to routine tasks, checklists ensure I do not forget any steps. Since utilising checklists in my day-to-day, there has been a marked increase in the level of quality of my output and also the speed of my delivery. Right, so that ties up the video, guys. Please remember to like, comment, and also please subscribe. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.